Kansas, August 1943. In the mess hall of Camp Phillips, 200 German prisoners stood frozen in line, metal trays extended, staring at what the American cook was placing before them. The steak covered the entire plate, 12 ounces of beef, charred on the outside, pink in the middle, still sizzling. Friedrich Hoffmann had not seen meat like this since before the war, had not imagined it existed anywhere while Europe starved. His hands began to tremble. The cook, noticing his hesitation, grinned and said something Friedrich didn't understand, then added a second piece. Plenty more where that came from. Hunger had become Friedrich Hoffmann's constant companion long before capture. The Afrika Korps had run out of everything in the final month's fuel, ammunition, hope, and most painfully, food. Rations had dwindled to hard biscuits and thin soup, portions that kept men barely functional but never satisfied. Friedrich, 23 years old, and formerly a butcher's apprentice in Bremen, had dreamed about meat with the intensity some men dreamed about home. Real meat, substantial and nourishing, not the occasional stringy bits that appeared in stew. Capture in Tunisia had brought different deprivations. The British holding camps offered survival, but nothing more watery soup, hard bread, water that tasted of chemicals. Men lost weight steadily, their uniforms hanging loose, their faces hollowing into skull-like masks. Friedrich watched his own body consume itself, muscle disappearing week by week, energy fading to a baseline that allowed only minimal movement. The transport to America had been 17 days of worse. Packed below deck with 500 other prisoners, Friedrich had endured seasickness, fear, and the constant gnawing emptiness that no amount of ship's biscuit could satisfy. Some men stopped eating entirely, their bodies rejecting the minimal food provided. Others ate mechanically, without pleasure or hope, just fueling basic survival. When the ship docked in New York, Friedrich could count his ribs. The processing at Camp Shanks took 3 days' medical examinations, delousing, paperwork, endless bureaucratic procedures that reduced prisoners to numbers and classifications. Friedrich stood in lines, answered questions in broken English, received clean clothing marked with PW on the back, and tried to understand what would happen next. The train journey to Kansas took 2 more days. Friedrich pressed his face to the window and watched America pass by endless farmland, painted barns, livestock that looked impossibly healthy. Small towns appeared and disappeared, their main streets lined with shops that seemed to be operating normally. No bomb damage, no burned buildings. No evidence that this country was fighting a war that had consumed Europe. Camp Phillips sat outside Salina, Kansas, covering hundreds of acres of flat prairie. The camp held 3,000 prisoners in compounds organized by rank and unit affiliation. Friedrich's barracks housed 60 former Afrika Korps soldiers, mostly enlisted men like himself, all gaunt and exhausted and uncertain what captivity in America would mean. The first evening, guards marched them to the mess hall. Friedrich expected the usual thin soup, hard bread, perhaps some weak coffee. Instead, the mess hall smelled like something he couldn't quite identify, something rich and savory that made his stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. The line moved forward slowly, prisoners receiving metal trays and utensils, approaching serving stations where American soldiers stood behind steel counters. Then Friedrich saw the food, real food, not survival rations or prison fare, but actual meals, mashed potatoes in generous portions, green beans, cooked and seasoned, fresh bread, thick slices still warm, and meat, actual meat, chunks of beef in gravy, more than Friedrich had seen in a single serving since 1941. He stood stunned, tray extended, while the server spooned portions onto his plate. The amount seemed impossible. The meat alone was more than a week's ration in the Afrika Korps. The potatoes were more than he'd eaten in the entire month before capture. The bread was fresh, not moldy or stale, or stretched with sawdust. Friedrich found a seat at a long table and stared at his tray. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some ate immediately, shoveling food with desperate speed. Others sat frozen, perhaps suspecting a trick or a test. A few began to cry quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden abundance after months of deprivation. Friedrich picked up his fork and cut into the meat. It was real, tender, properly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper. He chewed slowly, his atrophied stomach protesting even as his mind insisted on eating. The flavor was almost overwhelming rich, substantial, evidence of resources so abundant that even prisoners received real beef. That first meal changed something fundamental in Friedrich's understanding. Not dramatically, but the crack began there, the first fracture in the foundation of everything he had been told about America. The regime's propaganda had described a nation on the verge of collapse, its people starving, its resources exhausted. But no collapsing nation fed its prisoners beef and fresh bread. No exhausted country provided portions this generous to defeated enemies. The routine established itself over the following days. Wake at dawn, formation for count. Breakfast in the mess hall, eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, work assignments. Lunch sandwiches, soup, fruit. Return to camp. Dinner meat, vegetables, potatoes, dessert. Every day. Regular and reliable, and utterly incomprehensible. Friedrich gained 5 pounds in the first week. He could feel his body responding to adequate nutrition, energy returning, strength rebuilding. Other prisoners experienced the same transformation gaunt faces filling out, hollow eyes gaining focus, the general air of exhaustion lifting like morning fog. They were still prisoners, still captive, but they were no longer starving. The camp commander addressed them through a translator in the second week. "You will be treated according to Geneva Convention regulations," the commander said. "This includes adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate medical care. You will work, but you will be compensated. You will receive the same rations as American soldiers at this facility. You are prisoners, but you remain human beings entitled to basic dignities." The translator repeated this in German, speaking clearly and slowly. The same rations as American soldiers. Friedrich processed this statement, trying to understand its implications. American soldiers ate like this regularly? This abundance was normal for them? Not special prisoner feeding designed to soften them up, but standard military rations? The cognitive dissonance was almost physical. By the third week, Friedrich had gained 12 pounds and begun to think more clearly. Adequate nutrition had restored not just his body, but his capacity for observation and analysis. He watched the camp operations, studied the guards' behavior, listened to conversations among prisoners who spoke better English. What he observed contradicted years of propaganda. The guards were professional, but not cruel. The food was abundant, but not wasteful. The facilities were functional, but not luxurious. Everything suggested a system designed for efficiency and compliance with regulations, not for punishment or revenge. The Americans treated prisoners exactly as they said they would according to rules, with basic decency, as captives rather than as despised enemies. The work assignments began in August. Friedrich and 50 other prisoners were assigned to a ranch 30 miles from camp, owned by a man named John Mackenzie. The ranch raised cattle Herefords, hundreds of them, grazing across thousands of acres of prairie grassland. Mackenzie needed laborers to maintain fences, move livestock, handle the 1,000 tasks that ranching required. The first morning at the ranch, Mackenzie addressed them through a translator. "I don't care what uniform you wore or who you fought for," Mackenzie said. "On this ranch, I care about work. You work fair, you'll be treated fair. You slack off or cause trouble, you'll be back at camp doing harder work for less pay. We clear?" The prisoners nodded, understanding the essential message. Performance mattered, not nationality. The work was hard but honest. Mending fences under the Kansas sun, sweat soaking through shirts by mid-morning, moving cattle from one pasture to another, learning to work with animals that outweighed a man by 1,000 pounds, cleaning equipment, maintaining structures, all the endless labor that ranching demanded. Friedrich's body, still rebuilding from months of malnutrition, protested at every task. But the work felt purposeful, connected to real productivity rather than punishment. Lunch arrived at noon. A ranch hand drove out in a pickup truck, carrying food prepared by Mackenzie's wife-fix sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, cookies still warm from the oven. The portions were generous, the quality was good, and the simple act of being fed properly during a workday felt almost revolutionary to men who had survived on deprivation. Friedrich sat in the shade of the truck and ate his sandwich slowly. The bread was fresh-baked, the meat was thick-sliced ham, the cheese was real. He thought about Bremen, about his family, about whether they were eating this well. His mother's last letter, written 6 months before his capture, had mentioned increasing shortages, rations being cut, hunger becoming a constant companion. His family was hungry, while he, a prisoner in enemy hands, ate better than he had in years. The guilt was complicated and persistent. By September, the routine had become familiar. Work 6 days, rest Sunday. Regular meals at camp always meat, always substantial portions, always more than Friedrich could have imagined during the hungry months before capture. The physical transformation was remarkable. Friedrich had regained 23 pounds. His cheeks had filled out. His arms had muscle again. He looked almost healthy, certainly better than during his final months as a soldier. Other prisoners experienced similar resurrections. Men who had been skeletal were now merely thin. Eyes that had been hollow now showed life. The general air of desperation had faded, replaced by something approaching normalcy. They were still prisoners, still captive, still separated from home by war and ocean. But they were no longer dying slowly from deprivation. In late September, an announcement appeared on the barracks bulletin board. Saturday evening would feature a special dinner to celebrate Labor Day weekend. Friedrich wasn't sure what Labor Day meant, some American holiday, but the word special suggested food beyond even the generous normal rations. He tried not to get his hopes up. Special in a prison camp probably just meant slightly larger portions, or maybe fresh fruit for dessert. Saturday evening arrived with unexpected ceremony. The mess hall had been decorated with small American flags and bunting. Tables were set with actual tablecloths, not fancy but clean and white. Guards had dressed in their formal uniforms rather than work fatigues. The whole atmosphere suggested something significant, though Friedrich couldn't imagine what. The prisoners filed in, taking seats at assigned tables. The camp commander appeared and spoke briefly through the translator. Tonight we honor the American tradition of Labor Day by acknowledging all workers, including you. You've worked hard this summer, contributed to necessary agricultural production, and earned this meal. Enjoy. Then the serving began. Kitchen staff emerged carrying platters, not the usual steam trays, but actual serving platters like at a restaurant or formal dinner. And on those platters, arranged with care and garnish, were steaks. Real steaks. Individual cuts of beef, each one massive, covering the entire plate. Friedrich stared as a server placed one before him. The steak was easily 12 ounces, maybe more. Thick, properly cooked, charred on the outside with grill marks, pink in the middle, juices pooling on the plate. It came with a baked potato, the size of his fist, sour cream and butter available on the side, fresh green beans, a salad with multiple kinds of vegetables, fresh bread, real butter. The mess hall had gone completely silent. 200 German prisoners sat frozen, staring at the food before them, unable to process what they were seeing. Friedrich looked at the steak and felt something break inside his chest, not dramatically, but completely. This was more meat than he had eaten in a month. This was a portion that would have fed his entire family for a week back home. This was abundance beyond anything he had imagined possible while men starved across Europe. Someone whispered in German, "This cannot be real." But it was real, steaming on Friedrich's plate, smelling like heaven. Tangible proof that everything the regime had taught was a lie. America wasn't starving. America wasn't collapsing. America had so much that it could feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. Friedrich picked up his knife and fork with trembling hands. He cut into the steak, watching juice run across the plate. He raised the first bite to his mouth and chewed slowly, his eyes closing involuntarily. The flavor was overwhelming rich, perfectly seasoned, tender. His taste buds, dulled by months of bland prison food, and before that, by months of near starvation, suddenly came alive with sensation. He swallowed and took another bite. Around him, other prisoners were having similar experiences. Some ate with desperate speed, as if the food might vanish. Others ate slowly, savoring every morsel. A few couldn't eat at all, overwhelmed by emotion or by stomachs too accustomed to deprivation to handle sudden richness. Friedrich ate his entire steak, his entire potato, all his vegetables. He ate until his stomach was full, genuinely, completely full for the first time in over a year. Then he sat back and felt tears running down his face, unable to stop them, not entirely sure why he was crying. The cook appeared, making rounds through the mess hall, checking reactions. When he reached Friedrich's table, he noticed the empty plates and nodded approval. "Good?" he asked in English. Friedrich nodded, not trusting his voice. The cook grinned. Plenty more where that came from. He gestured toward the kitchen, where clearly additional steaks waited for anyone wanting seconds. Friedrich understood perhaps half the words, but grasped the essential meaning. This abundance was normal, sustainable, evidence of resources so vast that even prisoners could have seconds of steak. That night, lying in his bunk while his overfull stomach processed more food than it had held in months, Friedrich tried to make sense of what had happened. The propaganda had been lies. All of it. America wasn't weak or collapsing. America was so strong that it could fight a war on multiple continents and still feed its prisoners beef. The regime had sent him to war against an enemy that could casually provide abundance, while his own side rationed everything to near starvation. The realization was bitter and complete. He had fought for a cause that had lied about everything about enemies, about resources, about the fundamental nature of the conflict. He had believed those lies because everyone around him believed them, because propaganda was overwhelming, because questioning meant danger. But the steak on his plate had been more honest than any speech from the regime's leadership. Other prisoners processed similar revelations. Some remained in denial, insisting this was temporary or exceptional, or somehow a trick. But most recognized what Friedrich had understood. They had been lied to systematically, and the truth was revealed in simple abundance. A nation that fed its prisoners this well was not a nation on the verge of defeat. In the following weeks, Friedrich watched new prisoners arrive from the European theater. They went through the same cycle he had experienced: initial disorientation, first meals of shocking abundance, gradual weight gain, slow acceptance that American plenty was real and sustainable. Each new arrival's journey mirrored his own, confirming that this wasn't personal revelation, but systematic reality. By October, Friedrich had gained 32 pounds. He looked in the mess hall mirror and barely recognized himself. His face had filled out, his shoulders had broadened with restored muscle. His eyes had life that months of hunger had extinguished. He looked healthy, not just surviving, but genuinely nourished. The transformation was visible proof of what adequate food could accomplish. The work at Mackenzie's ranch continued through autumn. Friedrich learned ranching skills, gained competence with cattle and equipment, earned Mackenzie's grudging respect through consistent effort. Once, when Friedrich successfully treated a cow's infected hoof, using techniques he remembered from his butcher apprenticeship, Mackenzie clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good work." Just 2 words, but they carried weight beyond their brevity recognition. Respect, acknowledgement that skill mattered regardless of uniform or nationality. Winter brought different work and different foods. The camp menu shifted to winter fare stews, roasts, heavier meals designed for cold weather. But the abundance never diminished. Meat remained a constant presence at every dinner. Portions remained generous, quality remained high. Friedrich adjusted to expecting adequate food, though the adjustment itself felt strange. Hunger had been so constant for so long that its absence felt abnormal. Christmas 1943 arrived with elaborate ceremony. The camp administration organized a holiday program, decorations, religious services, special activities. And the Christmas dinner featured turkey whole roasted birds carved at the table, served with stuffing and cranberry sauce, and all the traditional accompaniments Friedrich recognized from descriptions, but had never actually experienced. His plate was piled high with turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, bread. Dessert was pineapple and pumpkin, both unfamiliar but delicious. Friedrich ate until he couldn't eat anymore, then sat in the decorated mess hall and felt the complex emotions of celebrating Christmas as a prisoner, well-fed and safe, while his family endured occupation and shortage. He wrote a letter home that evening, carefully worded to pass censorship. "Dear Mother and Father," he began, "I am alive and well in America. I am being treated fairly. The food is adequate, and I have regained the weight I lost in Africa. I hope this letter finds you well, and that you are able to celebrate Christmas with some comfort. I think of you constantly, and hope to return when this war ends. Your loving son, Friedrich." Adequate food felt like an understatement, but describing the truth that he ate better than he had in years, that prisoners received steaks while Germany rationed meat to tiny portions, seemed both dangerous and cruel. Better to keep it simple, factual, focused on the essential message. He was alive, he was safe, he was surviving. The letter took 4 months to reach Bremen. His mother's response arrived in May 1944, heavily censored but revealing enough. They were struggling with shortages, she wrote. Meat was rare, bread was rationed, hunger was constant. His father's butcher shop had closed for lack of inventory. They survived on potatoes and whatever vegetables they could grow or trade for. She was grateful he was alive and prayed for his safe return. Friedrich read the letter 3 times and felt the guilt deepen. His family was hungry while he ate beef regularly. His father, a butcher by trade, couldn't get meat while Friedrich received 12-ounce steaks. The fundamental injustice of it, that defeat had led to better conditions than victory, was almost impossible to process. But the truth remained undeniable. America had resources Germany couldn't match. By summer 1944, Friedrich had been at Camp Phillips for nearly a year. He had gained 35 pounds total, stabilizing at a healthy weight for his frame. He worked at Mackenzie's ranch with competence and occasional satisfaction. He ate 3 substantial meals daily, never questioning whether food would be available. He had adapted to abundance in ways that would have seemed impossible during the hungry months before capture. New prisoners arrived from France after the D-Day invasion. They were gaunt, exhausted, carrying the same hollow-eyed desperation Friedrich remembered from his own arrival. He watched them enter the mess hall for their first American meal and saw their reactions, the disbelief, the confusion, the slow understanding that American plenty was real. One new prisoner, a boy named Wilhelm, who couldn't have been more than 19, sat beside Friedrich at dinner and stared at his steak. "Is this real?" Wilhelm whispered. "Or is this some kind of test?" Friedrich cut into his own steak and answered quietly, "It's real. They feed us like this every day. Meat at every dinner, sometimes for lunch. The propaganda was lies." "All of it?" Wilhelm picked up his fork with shaking hands and took his first bite. Tears streamed down his face as he chewed, his body recognizing nourishment it had been denied for too long. Friedrich understood completely. By autumn 1944, the war's trajectory was obvious to anyone paying attention. Germany was losing on all fronts, retreating everywhere, sustaining casualties it couldn't replace. The regime's propaganda had stopped promising victory and now spoke only of fighting to the last. Friedrich listened to news reports and felt mainly sorrow for soldiers still dying, sorrow for civilians enduring bombing and shortage, sorrow for the entire waste of it. The camp's population swelled as more prisoners arrived from Europe. The barracks became crowded, the work details expanded, but the food supply never diminished. America's agricultural capacity seemed limitless, capable of feeding an expanding prisoner population without reducing portion sizes or quality. Friedrich had stopped being surprised by abundance, but new arrivals went through the same shock he had experienced. One evening in November, Friedrich was called to help in the kitchen. A flu outbreak had sickened several staff members, and prisoners with relevant skills were being recruited to maintain meal production. Friedrich, with his butcher training, was assigned to help prepare meat for the next day's dinner. The camp's cold storage room was larger than his father's entire shop. Beef carcasses hung in rows, professionally butchered, properly aged, more meat than Friedrich had seen in one place since before the war. The camp's head cook, a sergeant named Martinez, showed Friedrich how they wanted the steaks cut 12-ounce portions, trimmed but not wasteful, consistent thickness for even cooking. Friedrich worked with familiar tools and familiar motions. His hands remembered the apprenticeship before the war, the skills his father had taught him. Cutting meat was honest work, productive and satisfying. He prepared 200 steaks that evening, each one a substantial portion, each one evidence of resources that seemed inexhaustible. Martinez watched Friedrich work and nodded approval. "You know what you're doing," he said. "Where'd you learn to cut meat?" "My father's shop," Friedrich replied in halting English. "In Bremen, before war." Martinez considered this. "Your father's butcher shop must have been something before all this mess." Friedrich paused, knife in hand, thinking about the shop he remembered. It was good shop, but never this much meat. Never. He gestured at the cold storage, the hanging carcasses, the abundance. "This is—" He struggled for the English word, finally settling on impossible. Martinez laughed without cruelty. "Not impossible here. Just America. We got lots of everything. Sometimes I forget how lucky that makes us." The conversation stayed with Friedrich. Lots of everything. That simple phrase explained so much: why America could feed prisoners well, why it could fight on multiple fronts, why it would win the war. Not because Americans were better soldiers or better people, but because they had lots of everything. Resources defeated ideology. Abundance defeated propaganda. Steel and beef and industrial capacity determined outcomes more than speeches or beliefs. By December 1944, Friedrich had been a prisoner for 18 months. Camp Phillips felt less like captivity and more like simply life-structured routine, adequately comfortable. He worked, ate, wrote letters, and waited for the war to end. The Battle of the Bulge news brought brief hope to hardcore prisoners who still believed in victory. But that hope collapsed quickly when the offensive failed. Friedrich felt mainly tired of it all. Christmas 1944 brought another elaborate dinner turkey. Ham, all the accompaniments, generous portions, holiday atmosphere. Friedrich ate his meal with appreciation, but without the shock of his first Christmas in camp. He had adapted to abundance, normalized what had once seemed impossible. The transformation was complete. He expected adequate food now, took it for granted, barely remembered the constant hunger that had defined his existence before capture. That night, writing in the notebook he had purchased with prison wages, he tried to articulate what had changed. "I used to think America was weak," he wrote in German. "They told us Americans were soft, decadent, unable to sustain war. But I've learned the truth. America is strong exactly because it's wealthy. It can afford to treat prisoners well, because treating us well costs them almost nothing. Their abundance makes mercy easy. We fought a war against an enemy that could win without even being cruel. That's the real defeat, not military loss, but understanding we never had a chance against a nation with this much of everything. He put the notebook away and lay in his bunk, listening to other prisoners breathing in the darkness. The war ground on through early 1945, but the end was obvious. Germany collapsed from all sides, east, west, south, squeezed by forces it couldn't match. Friedrich continued his routine, working at Mackenzie's ranch, eating substantial meals, saving his prison wages, and waiting for official word of what everyone already knew. Victory in Europe was announced on May 8, 1945. The camp received the news with complicated silence. Some prisoners seemed relieved. At least the dying would stop. Others appeared devastated. Their entire worldview collapsed along with their nation. Friedrich felt mainly numb. The war he had fought was over, lost, finished. Now came the question of what happened next. Repatriation planning began slowly. Prisoners would remain in American camps until transportation could be arranged, until occupied Germany could absorb returning POWs, until countless bureaucratic details could be resolved. Friedrich continued working through the summer and fall, earning wages, maintaining routines, existing in the strange liminal space between war and whatever came after. In November 1945, his name appeared on a repatriation list. He had 10 days to prepare collect belongings, receive final pay, write final letters. Mackenzie drove to the camp personally to say goodbye, bringing a letter of reference stating Friedrich was a skilled worker, reliable and honest. Might help you get work in occupied Germany, Mackenzie said. You ever want to come back to America properly, you let me know. Friedrich shook his hand, thanked him in better English than he'd had 18 months ago, and felt strange gratitude toward an enemy who had treated him fairly. The journey home began in December 1945. Train to New York, processing at Camp Shanks, loading onto a transport ship. Friedrich stood on deck as America's coastline receded, watching the skyline shrink and disappear, carrying with it 2.5 years' unexpected experiences. He carried a small bag with his possessions and Mackenzie's letter of reference. He also carried 32 pounds more weight than when he'd arrived, health restored by adequate nutrition, proof that food determined fate as much as flags or ideology. The Atlantic crossing took 3 weeks. Friedrich spent most of it remembering the journey out, 17 days of hunger and fear and uncertainty. This return journey was shorter and less desperate, though what waited on the other side was no longer the Germany he had left. Defeat meant occupation, transformation, the need to rebuild from ruins. The ship docked at Bremen in January 1946. Friedrich disembarked into a city he barely recognized. Vast sections were destroyed buildings reduced to rubble, streets cleared, but surrounded by destruction. People moved through the ruins with faces showing exhaustion and grim determination. This was home, but home transformed by fire and defeat. He walked to his family's address and found the building damaged but standing. His mother answered his knock and froze, staring at him as if he might be a ghost. Then she pulled him inside with surprising strength, calling for his father, crying and laughing simultaneously, touching his face to confirm he was real. His father appeared, older and thinner than Friedrich remembered. They embraced awkwardly, emotion too large for simple gestures. His younger sister, now 17, stared at him with eyes that had seen too much. That evening, sitting in the cold apartment, fuel was scarce. Heat was rationed. Friedrich told his story. He described capture, transport to America, the first meal that had shocked him, the regular abundance that had restored his health. He described steaks, the Labor Day dinner, the simple plenty that America provided even to prisoners. His family listened with expressions that mixed relief at his survival with something like disbelief. "You ate beef regularly?" his mother asked. "Real beef? Not just once, but often?" "Every dinner," Friedrich confirmed. 12-ounce steaks sometimes. Fresh bread, vegetables, more than I could eat. His father, the butcher who hadn't seen such cuts in years, shook his head slowly. "We were told America was starving. We were told they struggled worse than us. But you're saying they fed prisoners better than we fed our own soldiers?" "Much better," Friedrich said quietly. "Much better than that." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Everything they had been told was lies. The enemy they had fought was wealthier, stronger, more capable than propaganda had ever suggested. The regime had sent millions to war against a nation that could casually provide abundance while Germany rationed everything to survival minimums. Friedrich pulled out Mackenzie's letter of reference, proof of employment in enemy territory. "An American rancher wrote this for me, recommending my work, saying I was reliable and skilled. He treated me fairly, paid me wages, fed me his own family's food during work days. Our enemies were more decent than our own leadership." His father took the letter, reading slowly, his butcher's hands thin now, weakened by years of deprivation, holding the paper carefully. "What do we do with this truth?" his father asked finally. "What do we do knowing we believed lies and sent you to war against an enemy that wasn't what they told us?" Friedrich had thought about this question during the long journey home. "We rebuild," he said finally. "We remember what was lies and what was truth. We teach our children to question propaganda and trust evidence. We never let this happen again." The words felt inadequate for the enormity of what had been lost, but they were the only answer he had. Friedrich reopened his father's butcher shop in 1947. Getting inventory was difficult in occupied Germany, but his letter from Mackenzie helped secure American contracts for meat supply. Slowly, over months and years, the shop rebuilt its business. Friedrich married in 1949, had children, lived the quiet life he had dreamed about during captivity. But he never forgot the steaks. Every time he cut meat in his shop, he remembered the cold storage room at Camp Phillips, the abundance that had seemed impossible. Every time his children complained about dinner, he thought about 12-ounce portions served to prisoners while Germany starved. The memory stayed sharp and specific, a touchstone for measuring truth against propaganda. In 1967, Friedrich received a letter from America. Mackenzie had tracked him down through Red Cross records, writing to ask how Friedrich had done after the war. They began a correspondence that lasted until Mackenzie's death in 1979. Letters exchanged across an ocean, two men from opposite sides maintaining connection because war's end didn't erase shared experience. Friedrich saved every letter, storing them with his other artifacts from Camp Phillips' prison ID card, his final pay stub, photographs of the mess hall and barracks. His children found these items fascinating, evidence of a time when their father had been young and the world had been at war. In 1985, Friedrich's oldest son asked why he kept all these reminders. Friedrich considered the question, standing in his butcher shop, hands familiar with meat after decades of work. "Because the steak was real," he said finally. "Because abundance defeated us more completely than armies. Because I learned that propaganda lies, but 12 ounces of beef on a plate tells the truth. Because I want you to remember that how nations treat their enemies reveals more than how they treat their friends." His son accepted this, returned to work, left the artifacts in their careful storage. Friedrich Hoffmann died in 1991, age 71, in Bremen, where he had been born. His obituary mentioned his war service, his capture, his time in America. It mentioned the butcher shop he had rebuilt, the family he had raised, the quiet life he had lived in reconstructed Germany. It didn't mention the Labor Day dinner in 1943, the 12-ounce steak that had shattered his understanding of enemies and abundance. But his children knew. They preserved his Camp Phillips artifacts, told their children about the grandfather who had learned important lessons from unexpected sources. They kept the story alive not about war's valence, but about a moment of abundance that had revealed truth more completely than any propaganda. The lesson didn't end wars or eliminate hatred, but it persisted, small and stubborn, in one family's history. Friedrich had expected cruelty and found decent treatment. He had expected deprivation and found abundance. He had expected propaganda to be true and found it was lies. The expectations were wrong. The reality was that wealth determines outcomes, that resources matter more than ideology, that a nation which can feed its prisoners 12-ounce steaks is a nation that can not be defeated by one that starves its own soldiers. That truth, learned over a Labor Day dinner in Kansas, sustained Friedrich Hoffmann through 46 years of post-war life. It was enough